A millionaire in a moment of utter despair leaves his own son behind in an old rusted car hidden deep within a forest. But just when it seemed like the end of the road, a new chapter began when rain pounded mercilessly against Scott's windshield, making it nearly impossible to see, even with the wipers on full blast. His grip on the steering wheel was iron tight, knuckles pale, as his eyes darted between the blurry road ahead and the rearview mirror, where a baby's wailing pierced through the air. The cries were relentless, sharp, and desperate, each one chipping away at his fragile resolve. Scott's chest ached, a tangled mess of guilt and despair. His plan had seemed so straightforward: drop the baby off at the orphanage in the next town and return to Melissa, erasing this mistake from his life. But now, driving through the relentless storm and under the crushing weight of his decisions, he realized it was anything but simple. Alexis's words echoed in his mind like poison. "You think you can keep hiding this? Either you stay with me and own up to your son, or I'll tell Melissa everything." The ultimatum was brutal, the choice impossible. Scott knew that if Melissa found out, she would never forgive him. He could already imagine her reaction, the heartbreak in her face when she learned the truth. Melissa, 9 months pregnant and glowing with hope for the child she called their miracle, had no idea. And he was nothing but a liar and a coward. The baby, swaddled in a worn blue blanket, let out a piercing cry, shattering the tense silence inside the car. Frustrated, Scott slammed his hand against the steering wheel. "Please, stop crying," he muttered, though he knew the infant couldn't understand. The anger brewing within him wasn't really aimed at the baby. It was himself he couldn't forgive. The sudden vibration of his phone jolted him. It buzzed on the dashboard, the screen lighting up with a name that made his stomach twist: Melissa. His hands trembled as he hesitated before answering, his voice unsteady. "Hello." "Scott." Melissa's voice was hurried, shaky, and filled with panic. "It's the baby. I'm having contractions. He's coming." Fear washed over him like ice water. "Stay calm," he said, trying to sound composed, despite the knot tightening in his chest. "Just breathe. I'm on my way to the hospital." "Scott, I'm scared," she cried, and he could hear someone sobbing in the background, likely her mother. "I'm coming," he reassured her, forcing himself to sound stronger than he felt. Ending the call, he pressed the gas pedal harder, but the cries from the back seat only grew louder, more desperate. His mind raced. He couldn't bring the baby to the hospital. Melissa would be there. Her family would be there. It would be the end. Then he saw it. To his left, hidden among the dense trees, was an old, abandoned car. Rusted and overgrown with vines, it looked like it had been forgotten for years. Scott slowed down, blinking through the rain as an idea struck him. A terrible, desperate idea. He could leave the baby there, just for now. He'd come back later. It wasn't a solution, but at that moment it was the only option he could see. Pulling over to the muddy shoulder, he killed the engine and took a deep breath. The rain was unrelenting as he stepped out, opening the back door and cradling the baby in his arms. The child squirmed beneath the blanket, crying even harder, as if sensing what was coming. Scott stumbled through the mud toward the car, his feet slipping with every step. He yanked the passenger side door, which screeched in protest, before finally giving way. The interior was pitch black and smelled of mildew. Carefully, he placed the baby on the back seat, adjusting the blanket to keep him warm. His hands shook as he lingered for a moment, tucking the fabric around the tiny body. "I'll come back for you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "As soon as I know she's okay, I'll come back." The words felt hollow, even to him. He slammed the car door shut, the sound echoing through the trees like a gunshot. Heart racing, he sprinted back to his car, mud clinging to his shoes, rain soaking him to the bone. He started the engine, the tires spinning in the mud before they finally gained traction. Accelerating down the road, his mind remained fixed on that rusted car and the baby he had left behind. Deep down, Scott knew his actions were unforgivable. He kept telling himself he would go back and that everything would be fine once Melissa was safe. But as he drove toward the hospital, the baby's face lingered in his thoughts, and the sound of rain felt like it carried the echo of a cry he might never hear again. The headlights from Scott's car cut through the darkness of the winding road as he sped toward his destination. The rain began to ease, but his mind was a chaotic storm of thoughts and irreversible choices. The weight of what he had done mere minutes ago pressed on his chest like a heavy stone. Yet, he forced himself to focus on one thing. Melissa needed him. When Scott pulled into the hospital parking lot, he braked abruptly and jumped out of the car, nearly running. The night's cold air, mingled with the damp drizzle, clung to his clothes, but he didn't care. Before entering the automatic doors, he glanced down at his soaked, mud-caked shoes. He paused for a moment, realizing he couldn't walk in like that. Fumbling nervously, he popped the trunk and grabbed a pair of clean shoes he kept for emergencies. Tossing the dirty ones aside, he hastily slipped into the others. The edges of his pants were still smeared with mud, but he ignored it. Wiping his hands on his jacket, he took a deep breath before stepping into the hospital. The strong smell of antiseptic hit him as soon as the doors slid open. The hurried footsteps and overlapping voices in the hallways amplified his anxiety. Everything around him was a blur, but his eyes searched for something familiar. That's when he spotted Melissa's mother, sitting in the waiting area with her hands clasped tightly, almost as if in prayer. She stood quickly, her face etched with worry. "Scott, thank God," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with distress. "She's already inside. The baby. It's coming so fast, I'm so scared." Her voice cracked as she swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'll go to her. She'll be okay," Scott reassured, though he doubted his own words. Following the signs to the delivery room, Scott felt time slow to a crawl. Every step he took was weighted with growing dread. When he finally arrived, a doctor in a white coat met him at the door and gestured for him to enter. Scott drew in a deep breath and stepped forward. The sight before him made his heart pound wildly. Melissa lay on the bed, her hair stuck to her sweat-drenched face. Her complexion was pale, her eyes wide with pain. She gripped a nurse's hand so tightly that her fingers had turned white. The room buzzed with activity. Doctors and nurses moved with controlled urgency, their voices blending into a frantic hum. "Scott!" Melissa called weakly when she saw him, reaching a trembling hand toward him. He rushed to her side, gripping her hand tightly. "I can't. It hurts so much," she whimpered, her voice cracking. He gently touched her face with his free hand, trying to soothe her, despite the storm of panic inside him. "I'm here, my love," he said softly. "You're strong. We're strong. We'll get through this together." But even to his own ears, his words sounded fragile, almost drowned out by the chaos around them. Scanning the room, Scott tried to make sense of what was happening. A heart monitor beeped steadily, but the tension on the medical team's faces told a different story. "She's losing blood," a nurse said, her voice sharp enough to pierce through the noise. The lead doctor glanced at the monitor with a worried expression before making quick adjustments to the equipment. "The baby is in distress," the doctor announced. "We need to move quickly." Scott felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. His grip on Melissa's hand tightened, but his own fingers felt cold and weak. He wanted to ask what distress meant, but feared the answer. Melissa let out another agonizing cry, her body arching from the pain. Scott tried to stay composed, but his mind was spinning out of control. Everything will be okay, he repeated, more for himself than for her. You've got this, Melissa. She turned to him, her face twisted with fear and agony. I don't want to lose our baby, she sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. You won't, Scott said, his voice breaking as he fought back his own tears. I promise you, everything will be fine. But deep down, Scott knew he couldn't make such a promise. The steady beeping of the monitors seemed to grow louder, filling the room with an unbearable tension. The alarms blared, cutting through the tense air as nurses exchanged worried glances. The doctor called for additional tools, and the team moved with a renewed sense of urgency. Scott felt the crushing weight of despair pressing down on his chest. He was powerless, stuck watching helplessly as his wife endured unimaginable pain. Suddenly, Melissa let out a final, gut-wrenching scream that seemed to split the very air in the room. Scott's eyes stayed locked on the frantic movements of the medical team. For a moment, the entire room fell silent, the tension broken only by the metallic clink of instruments being set aside. Scott held his breath, desperately waiting to hear the baby cry. But the silence that followed was unbearable. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice nearing a shout. "Why isn't the baby crying?" No one answered. The doctors continued working in grim silence, their faces drawn and focused. Scott's gaze flickered to Melissa, pale and weak, barely clinging to consciousness. His heart thundered in his chest, his world crumbling before him. Finally, the doctor stepped forward, removing his gloves with a somber expression. His face carried a weight Scott wasn't ready to face. "I have bad news," the doctor said quietly, pausing as if searching for the right words. His exhausted, grave expression spoke volumes before he even began. Scott's pulse quickened as his hands, still clutching Melissa's, started to sweat. "We did everything we could," the doctor began in a steady yet heavy voice. "But there were complications during the delivery. The baby suffered severe distress, and we weren't able to save them." Time seemed to stand still. Scott blinked slowly, as though the words didn't make sense. His eyes darted from the doctor to Melissa, desperately hoping someone would correct this nightmare. But the crushing silence confirmed the awful truth. "No," Melissa's voice broke, barely above a whisper. Her eyes searched Scott's face, as if pleading with him to undo this reality. "No, this can't be happening." Scott tried to speak, but the words lodged in his throat, a knot so tight he could hardly breathe. He gripped her hand tightly, trying to anchor her, and himself, amid the chaos. "I'm deeply sorry," the doctor continued, visibly uncomfortable with her anguish. "We did everything possible, but the umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck, cutting off oxygen. By the time we delivered, it was too late." Melissa let out a soul-wrenching cry, a sound so raw Scott had never heard anything like it. She tried to sit up, as though she could chase after the baby and rewrite fate, but her strength failed her. Scott gently held her by the shoulders, keeping her from collapsing. "I want to see my baby," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "Please, I need to hold them." The doctor hesitated, glancing at a nearby nurse. After a silent exchange, he nodded. "We'll bring them to you. You'll have a moment to say goodbye." The word goodbye hit Scott like a blow, a concept too painful to process. His thoughts spun wildly. He wanted to scream, beg them to bring his baby back to life, but deep down, he knew it was too late. Minutes later, the door creaked open and a nurse entered, carrying a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft white blanket. Scott shivered as she approached, tears glistening in her eyes. He didn't want to look, but knew he had to. The nurse carefully handed the baby to Melissa, who cradled them with reverent tenderness. Silent tears streamed down her face as she stroked the baby's still, peaceful features. "My baby," she whispered, her voice shattered. "My angel, why did you leave me?" She rocked the baby gently, as though comforting them, even though she knew it was far too late. Scott stayed beside her, staring at the baby with a crushing weight in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a choked sob escaped. A deep guilt gnawed at him, a shadow from his past creeping into this moment. He had left another child behind once, alone and vulnerable, and now his own child was gone. It felt like the universe was exacting its punishment. Melissa held the baby for what felt like an eternity, whispering words of love Scott could barely make out. Finally, the nurse returned, gently asking permission to take the baby. "No!" Melissa cried out, though her protest was more of a lament than a refusal. Scott gripped her hand tightly, whispering, "He'll always be with us, in our hearts." With trembling hands, Melissa released the baby, her body shaking with sobs. The nurse exited quietly, leaving the room steeped in a heavy silence. Scott looked at Melissa, who seemed like a shell of herself. Her spirit shattered. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to offer a strength he didn't possess. Deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a long journey of pain and regret for both of them. As he held her, his mind drifted back to the child he had abandoned in the woods. Hours passed. Scott remained by Melissa's side, holding her hand as she finally succumbed to exhaustion and the weight of her grief. The hospital room was silent, except for her unsteady breaths. Scott studied her pale face, her swollen eyes from crying, and felt the guilt bury him deeper. Every tear she shed seemed to reinforce the secret he carried. When Melissa finally drifted off to sleep, Scott gently released her hand, careful not to disturb her. Rising from the chair beside the hospital bed, he glanced at her one last time before quietly leaving the room. Each step he took down the hospital corridor echoed in his mind, mingling with the haunting memory of the baby he had abandoned in the woods. Outside, the morning was bright and sunny, a cruel contrast to the turmoil inside him. The clear blue sky seemed to mock his pain, as if the world carried on, indifferent to the weight of his mistakes. Scott climbed into his car, his hands trembling as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he drove toward the place that had been haunting his thoughts. The road, now dry, bore only faint traces of the previous night's storm. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the asphalt. But Scott saw none of the beauty surrounding him. His mind was fixed on one thing: reaching his destination, the clearing in the woods where he hoped to undo his terrible decision. As he arrived at the spot where he had left the baby, he pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out of the car. The warmth of the sun was drying the muddy ground, but the path was still slick and treacherous. Scott retraced his steps from the night before, his heart pounding harder with each stride. The trees, now illuminated by daylight, looked less menacing, but the weight in his chest only grew heavier. When he finally spotted the abandoned car, his stomach churned. The rusted, forgotten vehicle stood just as he remembered it. Its moss-covered hood glinted in the sunlight, and the partially open door seemed to beckon him forward. He paused, drawing a deep breath before approaching. His steps quickened, each one accompanied by the crunch of drying mud beneath his shoes. Reaching the car, he yanked the door open, the sharp screech cutting through the stillness of the forest. The back seat was empty. The blue blanket he had used to wrap the baby lay crumpled and discarded. For a moment, Scott froze, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He blinked, as if hoping his vision was deceiving him, but nothing changed. "This can't be," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. His eyes scanned the interior of the car, desperately searching for any sign of the child. It was no use. Grabbing the blanket, he clutched it tightly to his chest and stepped back from the car, his flashlight shaking in his grip. "Where are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Please, someone." The sun beat down, its heat rising, but all Scott felt was an icy dread. He began circling the car, looking for any clue, any trace of what might have happened. "Oh God, what have I done?" he murmured, his voice breaking. He rushed toward a nearby clearing, calling out for the baby as if it could answer him. His mind spiraled, consumed by every terrible possibility. What if an animal had found the baby? Or worse, what if someone else had taken it? The forest gave him no answers, only the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. His legs gave out beneath him, and he fell to his knees, still clutching the blanket. Tears streamed down his face as he shook his head, whispering over and over, "This can't be happening." For several minutes he remained on his knees, frozen in place. It felt as if the entire forest had turned its gaze on him, silently bearing witness to his anguish. Eventually, Scott rose to his feet, brushing his hands against his pants as he steadied his breath. He couldn't give up. He had to uncover what had happened. Holding the blanket tightly, he made his way back to his car, stealing one last glance at the abandoned vehicle. It had already become a symbol of his failure, but now it stood at the heart of a mystery he could no longer ignore. Starting the engine, the noise shattered the morning stillness. Gripping the steering wheel with intensity, Scott's mind was flooded with unanswered questions. As he drove down the road, a single thought consumed him. No matter who has it, I'll find it. After a long, exhausting day at the hospital, Scott finally brought Melissa home. She seemed so fragile, her vacant eyes betraying the immense pain she carried. Sitting in the passenger seat, she clutched the same blanket Scott had brought from the hospital, the one that should have held their child. Scott remained silent. He knew words were powerless against grief, this overwhelming. When they arrived, he opened the door for her, helping her out of the car. Melissa moved like a shadow of herself, her steps slow and burdened, as though the house, once a place filled with joy and dreams, had turned into a chamber, amplifying her sorrow. "If you need anything, I'll be in the living room, okay?" Scott said softly, his voice careful not to break the fragile silence. Melissa simply nodded, her gaze distant and unseeing. Scott gently tucked her into bed, pulling the comforter over her before quietly exiting the room and shutting the door. He descended the stairs and collapsed onto the sofa, utterly drained, but unable to find rest. His thoughts churned like a storm. Images of the baby in the woods, Melissa's unbearable pain, and the crushing weight of his guilt all circled endlessly, suffocating him. Earlier that morning, Gary had arrived at the campsite, brimming with excitement at the thought of escaping his everyday routine. It was his first time visiting the area with his parents, and the promise of adventure had him buzzing with anticipation. While his father pitched the tent and his mother sorted the supplies, Gary's eyes were already fixed on the forest's edge, drawn to the towering trees and their mysterious allure. "Gary, don't wander off too far," his mother called out, her focus still on the bag she was unpacking. "I'm just going to take a quick look," he replied, already grabbing his flashlight and heading toward the unknown. The forest was cool and quiet. The gentle rustle of leaves carried on the breeze. Gary felt the damp earth beneath his feet as he ventured deeper, moving farther from the campsite. He loved the thrill of exploring, always hoping to stumble upon something extraordinary. But on this particular morning, even his wildest imagination couldn't have prepared him for what lay ahead. As he followed a trail nearly hidden by overgrowth, a muffled sound stopped him in his tracks, a faint, almost imperceptible cry. He stopped abruptly, his heart pounding as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. Adjusting his flashlight, he swept the area, but saw nothing. The noise persisted, a fragile, insistent cry that tightened his chest. Gary followed the sound, carefully pushing branches aside and stepping over exposed roots. Then he saw it. The overgrown foliage partially hid an old, abandoned car. He hesitated, eyeing the rusty vehicle with shattered windows, as though it were some forgotten relic. The cries seemed to be coming from inside. With cautious steps, Gary approached. The passenger door was slightly ajar, and he gently pushed it open. The metallic creak shattered the silence, making his heart race. In the back seat, wrapped in a tattered blue blanket, lay a baby. For a moment, Gary froze, trying to process what he was seeing. The baby was crying, its tiny hands flailing, mouth open in a hoarse, silent scream as if its voice had given out. The blanket was partially undone, exposing a fragile little body that seemed lost in the cold, unwelcoming surroundings. Gary muttered, "Oh my God," feeling helpless. He scanned the area, hoping to find an adult who could explain this surreal scene, but there was no one. The car was empty, and the forest's silence felt heavier than ever. Gary knew he couldn't leave the baby there. Summoning his courage, he stepped closer and spoke softly. "Hey there, little one. It's okay. I'll get you out of here." Carefully, Gary lifted the baby into his arms. It was lighter than he expected, and the cries quieted slightly as he held it, though its tiny body trembled, vulnerable to the chill morning air cutting through the trees. Glancing around for answers, Gary noticed something on the back seat. It was a business card, partially obscured by dust and dried leaves, as though hastily dropped. Holding the baby securely, Gary reached out and picked it up. Elegant lettering read, "Scott Hamilton, CEO." The card also displayed a company logo and a phone number. Gary frowned, puzzled over its presence, but there wasn't time to think. Clutching the baby tightly, he began walking back to the campsite. When he arrived, his parents froze in shock at the sight of him, emerging from the woods with a baby in his arms. "Gary, what's going on?" his father asked, rushing toward him. "I found the baby in the woods," he explained quickly. "It was inside an abandoned car. No one else was around." Gary's mother immediately took the baby, wrapping it in another blanket while trying to soothe its cries. "Who could do such a thing?" she said, shaking her head in disbelief, her eyes wide with shock. Gary pulled the business card from his pocket and handed it to his father. "I found this near the car," he said. "Maybe it belongs to whoever left the baby there." His father examined the card closely. "Scott Hamilton, this is a big name. He must be someone important." "Then why would he abandon a baby?" Gary's mother countered, holding the infant protectively. The silence that followed was heavy with unanswered questions. They knew they had to act, but no one wanted to make the first move. "Maybe we should call this number," Gary suggested hesitantly. "Maybe they know what happened." After a brief discussion, his parents agreed. His father pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the card. As the call connected, everyone held their breath, waiting for an answer. After a few rings, a voice picked up on the other end. "Hello, is this Scott Hamilton?" Gary's father asked. There was a pause, as if the man on the other line was assessing who had called. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Samuel. I'm at a campsite outside the city. We found a baby in the woods, and your business card was nearby." On the other end of the line, Scott felt the blood drain from his face. He paused for a moment, struggling to find the right words. The mistake he thought he'd buried had suddenly resurfaced, unstoppable and glaring. "It's still there," Samuel insisted. "Yes," Scott finally admitted. "I need to know where they are." Gary and his family could feel the tension rising. Scott's tone was anything but reassuring. Gary's mother, her voice firm, spoke up. "First, we need to know who you are and why that baby was left there." The silence on the other end was deafening. Scott shut his eyes, taking a deep breath. He knew he had no choice. "I'll explain everything. Just let me find them," he said. Driving down the highway toward the campsite, Scott gripped the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding erratically. The call had left him shaken. One thought repeated in his mind like a mantra. The baby is alive. That fragile hope kept him going, but it also weighed heavily on his conscience. He knew that when he found the baby, he would face questions he wasn't ready to answer. A distant bonfire was dimly lighting the campsite when he arrived. Tents were scattered around, and the calm atmosphere sharply contrasted with the storm raging inside him. Scott parked the car and got out slowly, each step carrying the heavy burden of his responsibility. From a distance, he saw Gary, the boy mentioned in the call. He stood close to his mother, who held the baby tightly, as if protecting something precious. Scott's chest tightened as he saw the child, alive and safe. For a moment, his eyes locked on the small figure wrapped in a blanket. The baby seemed peaceful, blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding him. Scott had to summon all his strength to keep moving forward. As he approached, Gary's mother looked up, visibly tense, clutching the baby even tighter, as if sensing something was wrong. Gary stood next to her, curious, while the boy's father, Samuel, emerged behind them, his stance protective and wary. "Are you Scott Hamilton?" Samuel asked, arms crossed. "Yes, that's me," Scott replied, doing his best to sound steady. Gary's mother watched him closely, distrust evident in her gaze, her hold on the baby firm. "If you are who you say you are, then explain why that baby was left alone in that car," she demanded. Scott took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't tell the truth. He needed their trust before the situation spiraled further. "It was a terrible mistake," he said, forcing an expression of regret as his trembling hands gestured. "We were on a trip, and my wife and I lost control of the situation. He wandered out of the car, and we searched desperately, but we couldn't find him." "Wandered out?" Samuel repeated, his skepticism clear. "A baby? How does someone lose a baby in a place like this?" Gary's mother shook her head, her expression hard. "It doesn't make sense. That baby was abandoned, left alone. Who does something like that?" Scott stepped forward, his face etched with anguish. "I know it sounds ridiculous, but please, you have to believe me. My wife is heartbroken. We're living a nightmare. I just want to bring him home and fix this before it's too late." His words didn't sway her. She took a step back, holding the baby even closer. "I don't know if I can trust you. How do we know he'll be safe with you? Maybe we should call the police." The mention of the police sent Scott into a quiet panic. That would only complicate things further. Thinking quickly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Please, don't do that," he said in a low but urgent voice. "We don't need to involve anyone. I can make it right. Listen up to here. If you feel Scott deserves forgiveness and a new chance, leave a comment hamburger. Otherwise, leave a comment pizza so we can know how you feel. And now we will continue." He opened his wallet and pulled out a handful of bills, extending them toward Samuel. The gesture made everyone tense, but a flicker of doubt appeared in Samuel's eyes. "What are you trying to do?" Samuel asked, his face stern. "I just want to settle this," Scott said earnestly. "You found the baby, and I'm grateful. I want to thank you for taking care of him, but please, let me take him. We don't need to involve the police." Gary's mother glanced at her husband, visibly torn. Samuel hesitated, his gaze shifting between the money, Scott, and the baby. Finally, Samuel sighed deeply and nodded slowly. "All right," he said, taking the money. "But if anything happens to this child, don't think you'll get away with it." With visible hesitation, Gary's mother stepped forward and handed the baby over to Scott. Her expression remained tense, her eyes locked on him like a silent warning. "I hope you're telling the truth," she said, her voice heavy with frustration and worry. Scott gently took the baby, cradling him with care, and walked toward the car. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the guilt he carried was weighing down his body. When he reached the car, he paused, staring at the back seat. The infant car seat sat there, untouched and pristine. It was the one he and Melissa had bought for a child they'd never get to bring home. The fabric was unmarked, as though it had been waiting for this moment. A child who was never supposed to be there. But now, fate had placed a different life in that seat. Scott carefully secured the baby, fastening the straps with steady hands. His heart ached as he realized how perfectly the baby fit, as though the seat had always been meant for him. "It's yours now," Scott whispered softly as he clicked the last strap into place. "You're my son now." The baby stirred slightly, letting out a small sigh before falling back into a peaceful sleep. Scott closed the door gently and took a deep breath, glancing up at the night sky. The weight of his decision and everything it meant bore down on him. Sliding into the driver's seat, he started the engine and glanced in the rearview mirror. The baby slept quietly, oblivious to the magnitude of the moment. Scott gripped the steering wheel tightly as Melissa's face filled his mind. He knew he had to tell her everything. "I need to tell her the truth," he murmured in a shaky voice. But doubt crept in. What if she never forgives me? The thought echoed in the silence of the car, broken only by the soft hum of the engine. The road stretched out ahead, uncertain and fraught with unknowns, but Scott knew there was no turning back. When he arrived home, Scott entered, carrying the baby in his arms. The house was silent, except for the gentle sound of the baby's breathing. Shadows filled the living room, broken only by the dim light spilling through the windows. He looked toward the stairs leading to Melissa's room, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. Each step up the staircase felt like a struggle. Though the baby slept peacefully, Scott felt his presence as a reminder of the harsh reality he had created. Reaching the door, he hesitated, taking a deep breath before pushing it open gently. Melissa lay on the bed, her pale face etched with grief. Her eyes, once lively, were now dull, reflecting the emptiness left by their loss. She looked up in surprise, her voice weak but curious. "Scott, what are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately, stepping closer to the bed. The soft glow of the bedside lamp revealed the baby in his arms. Melissa's expression shifted instantly, a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Who is that baby?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. Scott's throat tightened as he carefully placed the baby in the crib by the bed, the crib they had lovingly prepared for the child who never came. Turning back to Melissa, who was now sitting upright, her wide eyes demanded an explanation. "I need to tell you everything," he began, his voice heavy with regret. The room felt suffocating as Scott realized there was no way to soften the blow of what he was about to confess. "I made a terrible mistake, Melissa," he admitted, pacing back and forth as if movement could help him find the right words. "Months ago, I had an affair with Alexis," he continued, his words hitting the air like a thunderclap. Melissa stared at him, her gaze unblinking, as if the weight of his words had frozen her in place. Her voice came out in a barely audible whisper. "You... what?" "It was a mistake," Scott rushed on. "I was weak, and Alexis got pregnant. Melissa's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a cry as tears streamed down her face. But Scott knew he couldn't stop now. There was more to say. When the baby was born, she began blackmailing me. He told me he would expose everything, destroy our lives. Running a hand through his hair in frustration, he looked lost. He had no idea what to do. Melissa shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. "And what did you do? How does this baby fit into all of this?" Scott felt his legs weaken beneath him, but forced himself to continue. "I took him the night you went to the hospital when your contractions started. I was with him, planning to leave him at an orphanage. But on the way you called, telling me you were in labor. I left him in the woods." The silence that followed was unbearable. Melissa looked at him as if he were a stranger, someone she didn't recognize. "You?" She rose slowly, her hands trembling. "Are you telling me you abandoned a baby in the woods? That you lied to me, betrayed me, and in the middle of everything, left a child to die?" "I went back for him," Scott responded quickly, his voice almost pleading. "I returned for him, but someone else had found him. A family saved him, and I got him back. He's here, Melissa. He's safe now." "Safe?" she yelled, her voice filled with anger and pain. "You left him in the woods like he was trash. How can you say he's safe?" Tears streamed down Melissa's face as she sank onto the bed, her body trembling with emotion. Scott dropped to his knees in front of her, trying to take her hands, but she pulled away, staring at him with disgust and disbelief. "You're a monster, Scott. I don't even know how I ended up having a child with you." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to shout, to defend himself, but he knew she was right. Nothing he could say would change what he had done. The baby stirred in the crib, letting out a small sound that broke the suffocating silence. Melissa's eyes shifted to the crib, her expression softening ever so slightly. Slowly, she stood and approached it, standing there, staring at the baby's sleeping face. For long minutes, the room remained quiet. Scott watched her, dreading what she might do or say. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and broken. "This baby," she said through tears, "has lost as much as we have." She turned to face Scott, her eyes still full of pain, but now laced with a surprising determination. "I want to raise him." The morning air in the Hamilton mansion was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that felt fragile, ready to shatter at any moment. While Melissa sat in the dining room having breakfast, Scott lingered in the kitchen, his eyes darting nervously to the phone on the counter. Alexis hadn't called that morning, but the weight of her absence felt just as oppressive as her previous relentless calls. Then, the screech of tires in the driveway cut through the stillness. Scott moved to the window, his stomach sinking. Alexis's red car came to a sharp stop, and she stepped out with a determined stride, her face etched with anger and frustration. Without thinking, Scott rushed out the front door, shutting it behind him to keep Melissa from hearing. "What are you doing here, Alexis?" he asked in a low but firm voice. She stopped in front of him, arms crossed, her eyes blazing with indignation. "You've left me no choice. I'm done waiting, done calling and being ignored," she snapped. "I told you I'd handle it," Scott replied, trying to sound confident, though he felt anything but. "Leave. This isn't the place for this conversation." "Handle it?" Alexis let out a bitter laugh. "Are you kidding me, Scott? You're not handling anything. You're just pretending it'll all go away." "Not here, Alexis," Scott said, stepping closer and motioning with his hands for her to calm down. "Let's talk somewhere else." "Talk?" Alexis narrowed her eyes, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Fine, let's talk. Why don't you start by telling me how you're actually dealing with this?" Before Scott could respond, the sound of the mansion door opening made them both turn. Melissa stood in the doorway, her expression stern and arms crossed, as if she were guarding the house from an intruder. Her gaze swept over the scene, noticing Scott's obvious anxiety and Alexis's defiance. "Who are you?" Melissa demanded, her tone sharp and full of suspicion. Alexis hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by Melissa's sudden appearance. She glanced at Scott, as if weighing her options, but quickly composed herself. "I'm Alexis," she said with forced calmness, offering a calculated smile. "I'm here to talk to Scott." Melissa narrowed her eyes, clearly unimpressed with the response. "About what?" "That's between us," Alexis replied coolly. "It doesn't concern you." "Anything involving my husband concerns me," Melissa shot back, unmoving. "So I'll ask again. What do you want?" Scott raised his hands, trying to diffuse the tension that felt like it was about to explode. "Melissa, please." But Melissa silenced him with a raised hand, her focus never leaving Alexis. "I'm waiting." Alexis sighed, her tone laced with exhaustion. "I'm here for my son." The words hung in the air like an unspoken storm. Melissa felt their weight immediately but maintained her composure. Her gaze turned colder. "Where is Scott?" Alexis demanded, shifting her focus to him. "You took my son. Where is he?" Scott opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced at Melissa, silently pleading for a chance to explain later. But Melissa didn't flinch. "The baby is here," she said firmly, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. Alexis's eyes widened, shock evident on her face. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, but she quickly regained control. "Here," she repeated, incredulous. "You brought my son to your house." "He's safe now," Melissa responded, folding her arms. "Because you didn't want him. Scott made that perfectly clear." Alexis let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Don't you want him? Is that what he told you? That I rejected my own child?" "That's exactly what you did," Melissa replied without hesitation. Alexis clenched her fists, anger radiating through her every movement. "It's not that simple. Scott and I have things to work out, and you're not part of this." "But it is simple," Melissa cut in. "You didn't want the baby, and now you show up here acting like you have some kind of claim to him." Alexis took a step forward, her expression growing darker. "He's my son. No matter what you think, I have the right to see him." "You have no right here," Melissa said firmly. "You abandoned him, Alexis." Scott tried to step between them, raising his hands in a bid to de-escalate. "Please, let's not do this. We can work this out another way." Alexis ignored him, pointing an accusing finger in his direction. "You think you can make decisions for me? Take my child and give him to her." Melissa stood her ground, though her voice turned sharper. "He's better off here, Alexis. And deep down, you know that." Alexis laughed again, her tone dripping with sarcasm, her eyes blazing with fury. "This isn't over, Scott. You can't just erase me from this. I'm not leaving without my son." She crossed her arms, her determined glare fixed on Scott and Melissa. The tension in the room was palpable, every breath heavy, as if one wrong word could ignite a full-blown eruption. "I'm not leaving without my son," Alexis repeated, her voice resolute and defiant. Desperate to keep things from spiraling, Scott stepped forward, his hands raised in a conciliatory gesture. "Alexis, please, let's talk. It doesn't have to be like this." "Talk?" Alexis laughed bitterly. "I tried talking, Scott. All you did was ignore me. I'm done talking. I'm leaving here with him." Standing beside Scott, Melissa stayed firm. Her posture was tense, but her resolve was unshaken. She knew Alexis was trying to manipulate the situation, but she wouldn't back down. Meeting Alexis's gaze, Melissa's voice was low but filled with unyielding determination. "You're not taking this child," she said. "You made it clear you didn't want him." Alexis opened her mouth to respond, but Scott cut her off, his voice trembling with anxiety. "If you wanted to, Alexis, He hesitated, taking a deep breath before continuing. I can make it up to you. I know money doesn't solve everything, but we can figure out another solution. Alexis slowly turned toward him, her eyes narrowing. Money? You think you can buy me off? Buy him off? I'm not trying to buy anything, Scott said quickly. I just want to avoid more pain, for all of us. You can move on with your life, and I can give him the home he deserves. For a moment, Alexis faltered. There was a flicker of hesitation in her expression, but her anger was still simmering. She shook her head, as if trying to push away any temptation to agree. No, she said sharply, it's not enough. He's my son, and I have every right to take him with me. You lost that right, Melissa said, her tone growing harsher. The moment you decided to use him as a bargaining chip. This baby isn't some object you can take or leave whenever it suits you. Alexis narrowed her eyes, clearly feeling cornered. Do you think you know everything? Guess again. You have no idea how this began or what I've been through, Alexis said, her voice sharp. Melissa stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. What I do know, Melissa replied steadily, is that you never wanted to be a mother. But I do. And I'll protect this child no matter what it takes. Alexis stormed out of the mansion, her heels clicking with determination. But the fire in her eyes revealed the conversation was far from over. Before climbing into her car, she shot a piercing glare at Scott and Melissa, who remained by the doorway. This isn't over, she warned, pointing at Scott. I'll be back, and next time, I won't be so patient. She drove away, tires screeching in a final act of defiance. Scott sighed deeply, running a hand down his face, while Melissa stood rigid, arms crossed, staring into the distance. Do you think she'll really come back? Melissa asked, her voice laced with worry. She will, Scott said with certainty. Alexis never backs down easily. That night, after settling the baby into his crib, Scott paced the living room, phone in hand, as he explained everything to his lawyer. His tone was calm but resolute. We need a definitive solution, he said firmly. I want to propose a deal. She gives up all rights to the baby, and in return, I'll offer her a substantial sum. The lawyer listened carefully before responding. That's a risky move. She might see this as an opportunity to demand even more money. I don't care how much it costs, Scott interrupted. I just want her out of his life. For good. The next day, the lawyer arranged a meeting in a neutral location. Scott waited anxiously in the conference room, his jaw clenched. When Alexis finally arrived, dressed impeccably with a cold smile, he knew she was ready for a fight. So, what's your offer? She asked, crossing her legs and giving him a pointed look. Scott's lawyer slid a document across the table. This is a legal agreement. By signing, you relinquish all rights to the child. In return, you'll receive a significant financial payment, transferred immediately. Alexis skimmed the document, her eyes scanning each clause. When she finished, she let out a low, bitter laugh, tossing the papers back onto the table. Do you really think you can buy me off that easily? She sneered, locking eyes with Scott. Is that all you think of me? This isn't about you, Alexis, Scott said evenly, though tension simmered beneath his voice. It's about what's best for the baby. He deserves stability. Something you've never wanted to give him. His words clearly infuriated her as her eyes narrowed. And what guarantees do I have that you'll keep your end of the deal? She asked icily. The money will be transferred as soon as you sign, the lawyer interjected, his tone professional. This agreement is legally binding. Alexis fell silent, drumming her fingers on the table as she weighed her options. Scott could tell she was calculating the risks and benefits. Finally, she spoke. I want additional assurances, she said sharply. I don't want this coming back to haunt me. It won't, Scott assured her, but you need to decide now. After a long pause, Alexis picked up the pen and signed the document, her face a mix of frustration and resignation. Fine, she said, dropping the pen onto the table. You win. He's yours now. Relief washed over Scott, though the weight of the decision lingered. The lawyer gathered the papers, signaling the process was complete. Alexis stood, grabbing her purse, and looked at Scott one last time. I hope you're happy, she said bitterly, and don't even think about contacting me again. She left, her heels echoing down the hallway. Scott sat in silence for a moment, letting the quiet settle over him. It was the end of one battle, but there was still much to rebuild. Back at the mansion, Scott found Melissa in the nursery, cradling the baby. Her expression was one of fierce love and determination. When Scott entered, she glanced up, her eyes full of emotion. It's done, he said softly, stepping closer. Melissa nodded, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. This child is our second chance, Scott. I'll raise him, but don't ever forget what he represents. Scott nodded silently, knowing her words held a truth he couldn't ignore. He knew the road ahead would still hold its challenges, but at that moment, he felt they had finally discovered a way to start over. This story reminds us that everyone makes mistakes, but second chances are precious opportunities to set things right. Scott and Melissa's journey shows that love, courage, and honesty can triumph even in the toughest times. What about you? Have you ever experienced a second chance that changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.